Ladies and gentlemen, as program director of the Thomas Mann House in Los Angeles, I'd like to warmly welcome you today for a truly worldwide debate on democracy and global justice. Melissa Williams, Zhaoting Yang, and Thomas Mann Fellow Rainer Forst have joined us today from Toronto, Beijing, and Frankfurt. Three world-renowned philosophers who will be discussing the idea of global justice in a new political world order from different cultural and intellectual perspectives. Perhaps you will share with me the impression that in the last year of the pandemic, the world has not only slowed down, especially with regards to the international order, some transformation processes seem also to have accelerated rather rapidly. According to a new study by the Global Marshall Fund, a fast-growing number of people on both sides of the Atlantic already see China as the most important player in international relations. In this context, it seems to be of particular interest to better understand China's political history of ideas, and even more importantly, to develop common ideas for just global order. Few political thinkers are more capable of such an exchange than Zhaoting Yang, Rainer Forst, and Melissa Williams. I'd like to thank you very much for participating in this conversation. I would also like to thank Benno Herz and Tyler Jack Anderson for their support, as well as our partners from the Goethe Institute Beijing, above all its director, Clemens Treter, to whom I would now like to give the floor.
Thank you very much, Nikolai. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished speakers. When Nikolai first approached me with the idea of bringing together at first Rainer Forst and Zhaoting Yang for a discussion on democracy, I was immediately excited by this prospect, as both take a very distinctively different look at democracy and also on the possibility of its realization. And these differences have their origins in their different respective philosophical traditions, but they also resonate in contemporary politics and the perceptions we have of each other. And we may not always reach the same conclusions, but understanding why we reach these conclusions is already a big step forward, and it opens up possibilities for more enlightened forms of cooperation. And this is also what is at the heart of the Goethe Institute's mission, to engage in dialogue, not only, but especially when challenges lie ahead. So thanks a lot for your willingness to be part of this talk, and thanks a lot to the Thomas Mann House for preparing and setting up this event. We are also very happy and thankful that Melissa Williams, while being a renowned thinker of her own, agreed to moderate this talk and structure the complex matters to be discussed. And therefore, I'm very glad to invite her now to take over and start the conversation.
Many thanks to Nikolai and to Clemens, and also to the Thomas Mann House for organizing this event and for inviting me to moderate. Your work in turning this historic house into a center of intellectual exchange is truly inspiring, a tribute both to the great Thomas Mann, but also to the power of ideas to shed light on a world in crisis. And it's such a pleasure to enter into conversation with Zhaoting Yang and Rainer Forst, two great thinkers whose work brings the power of two great philosophical traditions to bear on the crises of the 21st century. It seems fitting that we're using the instruments, the technological instruments of this century to join a conversation across three continents during this distinctly 21st century crisis of a global pandemic that prevents us from joining in person. A gesture of hope that maybe the ingenuity of our age, aided by great thinkers, might equip us to cope with the problems of our age. To my mind, this conversation is in keeping with the spirit expressed by John Dewey in his 1948 introduction to Reconstruction in Philosophy. He was writing this introduction, of course, in the wake of one great global crisis, to a text that he'd first published in 1919 in the wake of the First World War, based on lectures that he had recently delivered in China. And here I'm quoting from Dewey. He said, "The problems with which a philosophy relevant to the present must deal are those growing out of changes going on with ever increasing rapidity over an ever increasing human geographic range and with ever deepening intensity of penetration," end quote. So it's hard to think of two philosophers whose work better responds to Dewey's call for a philosophy relevant to the present than Zhaoting Yang and Rainer Forst. So I'd like to begin exploring your theories of, particularly beginning with your theories of global justice. Both of you have framed your contributions to the philosophy of global justice as a response in part to the human scale problems of a globalized 21st century. Zhaoting Yang, you've developed a theory of global justice for the 21st century grounded in the ancient Chinese concept of Tianxia. Rainer Forst, your account of global and transnational justice is grounded in the right to justification derived from Immanuel Kant's idea of the equal dignity of human beings as moral agents. So I'd like to begin the conversation by asking each of you to summarize as best you can in a short time the key features of your account of global justice. Ting Yang, if you would get us started, that would be wonderful.
Thank you, Melissa. Oh, okay. I think the Chinese thoughts are now still a little strange to the Western world, not very much known. So I will introduce a key concept, all under heaven. I developed a theory of all under heaven for the world politics. I think the all under heaven system should be transcendentally argued as Kant did. And I have tried to make it so robust. And, we have to consider the given fact that most people make rational choices when in pursuit of interests, and they are irrational when in defense of their values. It means human nature is always an ontological problem beyond ethics. Human nature fails ethics, and ethics fails to surpass human nature. That is why I try to establish my theory upon the ontology of coexistence instead of an ethical claim. Actually, every ethical claim is open to questions. The ontology of coexistence claims that existence presupposes coexistence. No one could refuse coexistence except a dead man. Let me explain a little bit. If there is only one person, he has the only problem of economy, and the economy is his ontology, but he is soon a dead man. If two persons, as the case in Bible, they have ethics more than economy, and ontology and ethics are one thing for him. As Confucius and Levinas built their theories about the two persons' ethics. If there are three persons, that means the many. They have the political problem as well as the ethical and the economic. The ontology coincide with the political. So I think, since we are talking about the political philosophy, I think political philosophy should be based based upon the ontology of coexistence. And my Tianxia, I mean, all under heaven theory, claims three constitutional concepts. First, the internalization of the world, inclusive of all nations in the world system, so that no more negative externalities in the world. Second, the relational rationality that gives priority to minimizing mutual hostility over the maximizing of exclusive interests, and stands in contrast to individual rationality and its pursuit of the maximization of self-interest. And the third, the Confucian improvement, requiring that one improves if and only if all improves. It means always the non-exclusive improvement for all and every. And it equals to that. Everyone gets a Pareto improvement if anyone does. I think it's my main point of the Tianxia theory. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful, succinct overview of your very rich theory. Reiner Forst, could you tell us a little bit about your theory of global justice based on the right to justification?
Thank you very much. I'm not sure I can do it as elegantly as Ting Yang just did, but let me start by thanking the Thomas Mann House and the Goethe Institute for inviting us to have this discussion, thanking Ting Yang for engaging in it, and last not least, thank you, Melissa, for being willing to moderate it, and I hope to enrich it with your thoughts. Now, I think Ting Yang and I share quite a bit more than you would think at first sight. We both start our theories about the need for a theory of global justice or global coexistence, as I think Ting Yang would prefer to say, from a hopefully, in my case, realistic understanding of the issues that fail coexistence, that fail cooperation, and that fail justice on a transnational level. We're not blind to the injustices in individual societies, but we also focus on, from a critical perspective, on the many injustices, in my case, of the globe. We both also agree that relativism about cultures and traditions is not a good position to start from when you want to think about a more just or a more beneficial global order. That is an important point, and I assume we will come back to that issue of grounding our theories. But at least, even though there are some differences with respect to how we think about the grounds or the anchors of our theories, we both think that coming from different traditions of thought doesn't mean that you remain locked into different traditions of thought. And we both share, even though with different emphasis, the idea of relational rationality, that apart from strategic or instrumental rationality, to say it in Frankfurt School terms, since this is where I come from, also geographically at this hour, that apart from instrumental strategic rationality, which Ting Yang just there is a relational rationality, and it is something we ought to build our theories on. My reflections on justice generally, whether it is on a national scale or on a transnational scale, start from unpacking what the notion of justice means. I think despite the huge variation of interpretations of what it means to have a just normative orders, I think the avoidance of arbitrary social relations and of arbitrary decisions is essential to the concept of justice, however, whichever conception of justice you favor. If we unpack arbitrariness, it means that a decision, an institutional scheme, doesn't rest on good reasons, on proper justifications. So from justice, we arrive at the avoidance of arbitrariness, and we arrive at a notion of justification. A just social order is a well-justified one. And at this point, Ting-Yang and I, and you, Melissa, we will have different ideas of what a justified, or slightly different ideas of what a justified social order is. But I, at this point, make a reflexive turn. If we disagree about what the best justification for a social order is, let us turn justification into a practice where you and I and we deliberate, argue, contest the reasons each of us thinks are the best reasons for installing, establishing a normative order, a certain scheme of norms. So that for me means that actually the practice of justification is at the core of a notion of justice. And that core means that the first task to establish a just social order is to establish structures of justification where those who are subject to such an order can become, at least to some degree more than they are now, the subjects to deliberate about and decide about the orders they are subject to. That also makes a link between justice and democracy. And I'll end with, since you referred to the tradition of thought I come from, which is apart from the Frankfurt School, if you dig a little deeper and go back a little further in time, though I don't go back in time as much as Ting-Yang does in his theory, which goes back to ancient China, pre-Confucian ancient China, I go back to Kantian thought and German idealism, because what I just laid out makes not just a connection between justice, justification, and democracy, but my reading of relational rationality means that it is the faculty of reasoning that not just is essential in establishing the practice of justification, but that the faculty of reasoning is a normative faculty as human beings. And here I use some ontological formulations now as an offer for Ting-Yang and you. We as reasonable, rational beings have the capacity to establish practices of justification in which we can become autonomous in the sense that the norms that guide our lives are norms we have arrived at together. So the notion of reason I'm working with is relational and a normative conception of reasoning, and every rational being in that respect has what I call a right to justification, a right to be a justificatory authority equal to all others with whom he or she shares a normative order.
Thank you so much, Rainer. I'd like to take this back to Ting-Yang in particular. Rainer has offered us an account, and I appreciate what Rainer has said by way of showing some of the strong continuities between your views and the idea of relational rationality that are and what Reiner offers us is an account of how we establish a relational approach to understanding our obligations to one another. And so I'd like to take it back, Ting-Yang, to your idea of the ontology of coexistence and the internalization of the world. I think what Reiner is offering us is an account of a particular kind of human practice, a practice of reciprocal mutual justification by which we establish as a shared ontology, this ontology of coexistence, and through which then we come to internalize a sense of a shared world. So my question for you, Ting-Yang, is whether how you think about the practices whereby we achieve this ontology of coexistence, the internalization of the world, and whether you're persuaded that the practices of justification are the most important practices by which we accomplish that.
Well, I admire quite a lot, quite much about Professor Reiner's the right to justification and the justification of the justice. I think, yes, I agree. Reiner, you are quite a Kantian, and you are trying to do the fundamental grounding for justice. And I'm someone maybe from the middle age, so even older than you are. But I think both of us are too old for the contemporary world, not the very popular one. I think I'm less ambitious as you to make a ground for the justice, because I think the Tianxia system is not able to remove all the injustice and the unequal, because there have been so many injustice in the world since the first day of the first man, and we are still short of wisdom to find the best solution. May I tell you a joke? Lao Tzu, one of the earliest Chinese philosopher, has a theory. He said, no one would fight for anything if let everyone have nothing. I think that it is a good theory, but a worst world. So I think what I mean is it's not easy to remove the injustice. And for me, my concept of justice is rather traditional and even conservative. I think justice means symmetry. So it's quite different from the popular modern concept of justice in terms of equality. So I think instead, Tianxia system is trying to deal with the world size problems. I mean, the global problems, such as the risk of AI, the gene technologies, the domination of global capital, and the climate change, food shortage, pandemic, and economic crisis, and other dangers. All such a global crisis indicates the increasing entropy of our world, the disorder index. And the increasing entropy of this world is actually related to the reducing entropy of the states, I mean the nation states. That is, the lower entropy of the state could produce and impose the entropy onto the world. In other words, the lower entropy of states is at the cost of the higher entropy of the world. I'm sorry, I think the best example is that the dominating military power of America, which imposes the insecurity of to other countries. So I think Tianxia is intended to be a global system for world peace, reciprocal security, and the maximization of cooperation. In one word, Tianxia may decrease the entropy of the world. I think it is still a long way to the justice world, the world of justice, but on the way to it.
Thank you, Rainer. Would you like to respond? I have some further questions for Tingyang. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about how you understand the Tianxia concept as a way of, as an alternative to the system of world power that we have now. You spoke about American military might in a world of states. Your Tianxia concept takes us beyond a world of states to a one world system. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit for us the processes by which you think the Tianxia concept leads to this internalization of the world, of the idea that we coexist, we share a single world, and we need to have an imagination of that shared world as the foundation for our relations with one another, which stands in contrast, if I understand your argument correctly, it stands in contrast with an understanding of the world as comprised of separate states, the Westphalian order that we have inherited from European modernity. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about how we might make a transition from a world of states to a one world idea, and how the concept of Tianxia helps us to imagine this alternative.
You know, so far I have argued for my concept, the basic concept as a kind of ideal for the future world in terms of Tianxia, including the relational rationality, something just we have talked, but there is still a long way from the concept to the reality. I'm always thinking about it, and of course, I think there are some strategies, but not really enough for us to bring it into the practice. I think it is still too early. I think I have to explain if we have the Tianxia system, the states, I mean the nation states, will remain there. They will not be removed, never. I mean, the Tianxia system is something like another layer, adding on to the nation state system. Tianxia is a network, a kind of network to help developing the cooperations and the reciprocal knowledge and understanding and the security of every state. It's a cooperating system, not to remove the countries. And yes, if we will on the practical way to Tianxia, I think of course we need a democracy. That is why I later developed another theory of the smart democracy. I hope it will help a little bit, but it is not enough. we need the theory of justice from Professor Renner.
Rainer, would you like to respond? I mean, your work has also been critical of an idea of global order based exclusively on a system of sovereign territorial states. Perhaps you would say a few words in response to Ting Young's view and offer us an account of how you see a transition toward a more just world unfolding.
Well, maybe two things. First, about the conceptual debate we began with. I do understand that Professor Zhao wants Tianxia to be situated at a level at which there are no maximal demands for a global cosmopolitan just state or other ideals like that. But look, already the description of Tianxia as symmetrical cooperation, and you saying that the domination of global capital is an issue that your model of cooperation has to address, I think implies at least some form. I don't want to say minimal because it's quite demanding, a quite demanding form of justice. Because as soon as we use the language of domination, as you do, not just here, but also in your work, non-domination as an imperative of justice, I think, does appear. So I don't think we can avoid the language of injustice in the analysis of the transnational structures to be overcome, or in the normative framework we aim at, even though I agree that talking about justice in that way of establishing more just terms of transnational cooperation would not remove all the injustices that the current world order has been built on. If we just think of colonialism, we cannot undo the many consequences colonialism has had, but we have to keep in mind the history of colonialism when we talk about the terms of cooperation on a transnational level. And I think we agree here that a historical perspective is necessary to understand the dynamics of a global system, whether it is a financial system or, of course, as you also refer to, the global ecological problems which hit us all, but not all equally. There are parts of the world where those live who have caused global warming to an enormous extent, more than others, and there are other parts of the world where those who have produced less of these of the causes for global warming suffer a lot from it. I think that's also a justice problem, and we can't avoid that talk. I also agree, and that, Melissa, apologies, comes back to your question, that a more just global order can't do away simply with states. I mean, how would that work? But I think real change in orders only comes about if there are social movements forming which address the issues of systemic injustice, whether it is the women's movement, the workers' movement as it used to be, the ecological movement, without movements which transgress, which transcend borders and national interests. I do not think that the discourse, the political discourse, can be changed, nor do I think that the power can be generated to change anything. So that is the kind of locus of power, and I also look in Melissa's direction, because her work very much has emphasized the issue of generating power through social movements. I think without that, we won't even have a proper discourse addressing the injustices, and then building on that. And if things go well in a coalition of some states, adopting the issues of social movements, and I think the ecological issues will be the ones most successful in the years to come, forming a grander coalition, whereas issues of economic reform notoriously have to overcome national egoism and the power of transnational companies, which is much harder to overcome. But I'm not giving up hope that social movements will not develop only as one issue movements, because everyone has to see that ecological justice in a transnational way is so much connected to other aspects of transnational justice that refer to, as you said, to the financial globalization and the economic order. So these things are connected. So a long-winded answer, and I apologize. When we talk about changing normative orders, we have to look into possible dynamics of the formation of emancipatory power. And I think without social movements that transcend nation states, the kind of move toward either transnational justice, Frankfurt style, or Tianxia, Zhao and style, and referring to the long tradition of Chinese thought will not come about. We have to think about the forces that generate such power.
Thank you so much. Tingyang, if I would love to hear your response to that. Rainer has given us an account of how, basically, one way of thinking about what Rainer has said about the power of transnational social movements is that these are a vehicle whereby the world becomes internalized by human agents. That is, that people involved in these movements have an imagination, they have a political imaginary that encompasses relationships across borders. And that then can be the engine for transforming relations of power, so that we have more just relationships based on principles of reciprocity. And so I would love to hear your thoughts about what other vehicles for the emergence of a political imaginary of one world you have in mind. In your description of Tianxia, in the accounts of it that I have read in ancient China, you talk about Tianxia as having a kind of centripetal force, as a kind of whirlpool, as a cultural, a set of cultural practices and ideas that have a kind of gravitational pull on people. So this is to contrast the model of power as a hegemonic imposition by one will on another will. In contrast, you depict Tianxia as an attractive force that draws people in because it has a very appealing way of understanding our relationships. That is, as you say, a universe of compatibility that strives to find ways of living together that are responsive to our diversity. So I'm curious how your understanding of Tianxia as a centripetal force contrasts with the sort of bottom-up formation of a one world consciousness through social movements that Rainer has offered us.
You know, I think the concepts of Tianxia I'm talking about is a new one. It is quite different from the ancient Chinese model. Of course, in my book, when I give a historical study of the origin of this concept, I refer to the ancient China model. It is, as you know it, it's a kind of weak pool, you know, to absorb the many factors around the center into a movement. And I think it is an effective model only in the ancient condition. It's not for our world, not for the contemporary, and not for the future. The new Tianxia system looks like the network, you know, like an internet. It will be structured like an internet. There will be no center or many centers, if you want. So I think we have to practice on the new principles. Actually, the three principles I have just talked are not the ancient one. It's a new one. I think it fits with the internet model quite well. But I think it's still a long way to reach there, because you know, the most unjust in our world, I think it is the global capital. I think it is the biggest problem. I have no idea to deal with it. You know, it's a very strange. It's so powerful, and more powerful than any practice we could think of. So I think that it is the biggest problem. I'm sorry. Let me explain a little bit. You know, the capitalism is not the worst, as we know it. The industrial capitalism means we sell ourselves to the capitalists at low price. But now, even worse, the financial capitalism means we sell our uncertain future to ourselves at the risk of losing everything, while the capital players use our money for themselves, so that the financial capitalism has surprisingly become the charity to support the richest. And you know, from the point of view of the Middle Age, to sell time and the future is an ontological crime, because it sells something not existing. I think that God will be angry with this usurpation. If the world go on this way, I think it will be dominated by the new despotism. And that is the despotic financial capitalism to rule with the high technologies, the most powerful things in the world. So, so I think it is a real challenge we have to face. And I confess I have no good idea to control it. I don't know how to deal with it. Maybe Rainer, you have one.
I wish I had a model and also could show you the way how it could materialize into reality. And I would like to give the question back to further to Melissa. Maybe she has an idea in her view about global justice. But let me just respond briefly about your your idea that the new Tianxia system would be like a network. And the question is, I think this is a good metaphor, and it is fitting to a lot of global developments, especially the spread and the power of global capital you have been describing, which is so powerful that it actually transcends not just national but ideological differences. Think about how much contemporary China now is part of a global financial system that, without China being an active player in that system, would immediately break down. And so that is how powerful it is. And the question is, if we think about the kind of power that would be strong enough to regulate the flow of global capital, to regulate the use you can make of it, where the limit is to how much you can exploit people in countries working for very, very poor wages, but still working for a transnational company, because without these poor wages, they might not have any wage at all to feed their kids and themselves. So if we think about not just the principles of such a change of the global normative order, but of the power required to, at least to some extent, I mean, when we talk about the regulation of global financial capital, we in our wild dreams, we don't talk about completely overturning it, but about regulating it to some extent that, extreme human rights violations would be avoided, blackmailing states to do this rather than that would be avoided, and maybe even a tax on global transactions, as Tobin and others have suggested, could be possible. If we think about the power required even to manage these goals, I think we might need more than a network system. We might actually require an institution that has legitimacy chains and also effective power to regulate or establish a normative order that regulates global capital. So that may be an old-fashioned way of thinking about justice materialized through institutions, but our thinking about what justice would require has to be in tune with the forces of domination to be overcome, or at least to be checked or to be controlled. And so I think this would speak for Tianxia, at least with respect to global capital, also possibly with respect to ecological issues, having requiring more of an institutional structure, an accountable structure than a network. And sorry, Melissa, I meant to bring you in, whether you can
I think this is fantastic.
in realizing justice.
Yeah, no, I think this is fantastic. And I want to turn the conversation in a moment to the theme of democracy and how democracy fits into this picture for each of you. But I think it is interesting to see how many commonalities there are in your two views. First, that the structures of power that are currently exerting a dominating force on humanity now are themselves decentered and networked. Global financial capitalism. Also, both of you are offering a normative alternative to counteract this structure of power, which is also decentered, horizontal, networked, whether it's networks of transnational social movements or networked understandings of how we are all connected in one world. which can perhaps serve as a resource for resisting these forms of power at a global scale that are otherwise very hard to capture and resist, precisely because they're not centered in a particular state or a particular institutional structure. That makes them quite elusive when it comes to efforts to contain, regulate, control them. This then raises the vexed question of whether we need institutions with coercive power, with the power to generate laws that can be coercively enforced in order to block these new forms of transnational power that are forces of domination in the world. Rainer, you haven't suggested a single such institutional structure at the global scale. Ting-Yang, I'm not sure exactly what your views are about whether we need a coercive power above the level of the state, or alternatively, what other means we might have of regulating these forces of domination. Maybe if you have a quick answer to that very big question, that would be great. I mean, one of the things I was struck by in reviewing some of your writings about Tianxia theory and in its ancient form was that the center of the system did have superior military force and to all of the other elements in the system. So it wasn't a state, but it had this state-like quality of having superior coercive power relative to the other entities in the system. So this then generates the question, do we need some supranational, a world state or some alternative, some other way of institutionalizing coercive power that isn't a world state, but still has this capacity to regulate transnational actors? I'm curious what you think.
I fully agree with Rainer that we need a global institution to arrange things, but I'm hesitated to say we need a world government. That is why I think the network of Tianxia has no center, perhaps many center. But anyway, we need some institutions, effective institution to responsible for the many things. For instance, I think Piketty has a good idea about the global taxing. I think it's a very good idea. But my question is, who has the power and the responsibility to do that? It seems impossible. It seems also only a concept. So I think the key point is we are getting to the key point. If we need an institution or even a government, a world government, to responsible for so many things, that means it should have power. And I think the power is dangerous. So that is why I'm hesitated about it. So I think that we need more careful thinking about it. We have no conclusion now.
Can I follow up on this, because I totally agree, and I think you wisely, Melissa, brought in the notion of democracy here, and I'm on board with Ting-Yang asking us to develop our political imagination in new ways, and I would like to underline, because this is often understood, many people think that Ting-Yang cherishes the ancient feudal system where the term Tianxia was formed, but this is not what he believes. This is just the lineage, the tradition he refers to, and which he reinterprets radically. Now, along this line of rethinking politics and developing our political imagination, I think it is important that we also rethink the notion of democracy. We will not move out of current crises, including the pandemic that is currently over us, if we do not develop a notion or notions of what democracy can mean beyond the nation state. Our political imagination is so caught up with or caught in the imagination of a nation state, of a sovereign nation state, that we need to work hard. And this needs to be a work of global conversations like we're having, and of global scholarship, and also engagement in practice to rethink what democracy means, because otherwise we will always run into the grave contradiction that the main issues that need to be addressed politically are of a transnational nature, but the institutions we have are all of a national or an international nature, which essentially requires the consent and also implies the veto of states. And so thinking about what democracy means beyond the nation state is essential, but I think there's a second aspect to rethinking democracy. We are used to think about democracy as something that happens within a fixed institutional framework. First, there's a framework, a constitutional framework, a framework of lawmaking and of law application. But couldn't democracy, especially in a situation like we talk about, also mean to establish, to think about new institutions? Couldn't democracy be a practice that's not just a social movement practice and not just a fixed within given institutions bounded practice, but something in between? Couldn't democracy, or doesn't democracy have to mean not just to think about, but to start to bring about institutions that serve the aims we have been talking about? So something like constructive or creative democracy that builds itself, so to speak, as we practice, as we engage in democratic practice. That is something we need to have a better idea of, which you guys have, I think, better ideas of than I do. But this is the way in which we should reinterpret democracy, I think.
Well, that's very rich. Thank you so much. It opens up many pathways of thought, but I would like to stay focused on the concept of democracy. Rainer, you've brought out that our usual understandings of democracy located within the boundaries of the territorial state. If we understand democracy generally in its ideal form as a method whereby we can produce solutions to collective action problems on terms that are legitimate, then the conundrum we face is that the collective action problems of the 21st century are global in scale. If democracy is the legitimate way of addressing collective action problems, then we need democracy above the scale or beyond the scale of the state. So I'm in full agreement with you about that, but we haven't really explored yet together what we mean by democracy. Even among democratic theorists, democracy means many different things. And Rainer, your account of democracy is in the tradition of discourse-based or deliberative democracy, whose understanding of political legitimacy is based on the justifiability of the actions that we take as they affect others. So we need to be able to justify to those who are affected by our decisions, why those decisions take their interests and needs and perspectives seriously into account. So I'm curious now to hear from Ting-Yang. You've offered an account of what you call smart democracy, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about that. I think one of the larger questions in the background, given the current crises of representative democracy in many Western states at the moment, is whether democracy is more a problem than a solution. So what do you mean by democracy, and how can democracy be more of a solution than a part of the problem?
Melissa, I have read your paper about the deliberative democracy. I like it very much. You know, I'm brought to the problem of democracy is because of the contemporary situation. As I see it, democracy has now declined to become a publicracy. The word I coin it, so it's a publicracy. Contrary to the public use of reason as Kant advocate, the publicracy develops the contingent of dominating opinions out of collective irrationality, and spoil the public sphere, even let democracy become the battle of parties supported by Iron Bank. I'm sure you watch the Game of the Thrones, the Iron Bank. Yeah, so it is. I think it is the public misuse of reason. So I fabricate the smart democracy, partly based on the very old philosophy Zhizi. I mean, the smart democracy is supposed to find a rational balance between the desirable and the feasible, or between what people want and what is reasonable by reason. Or it could be said the equal respect for both the wants and the wisdom. I try to make the smart democracy a system with wisdom in itself. So it has two main points. First, I'm sorry, it's complicated. I have to take some time. The first, smart democracy will run a one-person, two-vote system, alternative to the popular system of one person, one vote. The basic rules for the two-vote system as follows. First, the net pros rule. That is, the net pros means the pros minus cons. Suppose, let me give example. Suppose A gets 51 pros and 31 cons. Then 51 minus 31 make 20% net pros, while B gets 41 pros and 11 cons. So 41 minus 11 make 30% net pros. So it's contrary to the our usually voting. B will be the winner. And the second rule is usual, the conditional majority rule. If A and B coincide in their net pros, the one with more pros wins. Why two votes? I think you know, everyone has her positive as well as negative preferences, so that the two faces of our mind should be fairly represented in two votes. I mean, one vote represent half mind. So I need 2 votes. Of course, when you go to vote, one could give only 1 vote, either pro or con. I think the 2 vote system will remind the candidates of more reasonable or impartial goals, so that to avoid a large numbers of cons. The 2 vote system might be good for the political stability and the cooperation of society. I do think so. And the second point is the smart democracy will have 2 rounds of voting instead of 1 round, always with a 2 vote system. The first round of voting would be the general election in the modern way by all people, and the general voting decides what people want. Then the second round of voting will be limited to 2 separated scientific committees, one of sciences and the other of humanities, consisting of the respected, honest scientists, philosophers, economists, historians, etc. Someone like Melissa and Renner, to study the candidates if they were practically reasonable before their final votes, according to the so far and well recognized knowledge and argument. So I think it is essentially it is the voting by knowledge rather than by persons. And I think the result will be, the 2 rounds of voting defines the separated authorities. People decide the desirable, and the scientific committees decide the feasible. Or I mean, the scientific committee has no right to choose what is desired. Instead, they have the right to approve or disapprove of what people want. So you see the public choice in 2 steps, or on 2 levels. And I mean, the smart democracy is essentially the knowledge-weighted democracy, and it will exclude the unreasonable or crazy choices. If so designed, democracy could become institutionally intelligent, so that it could be said smart in itself and by itself. I emphasize on knowledge because knowledge matters more than opinions. If we refuse knowledge, we abandon civilization. And if we agree on this smart democracy, we should invite Habermas now. He could help us with his communicative rationality. As I discuss it, this communicative rationality could only develop mutual understanding of mind, but fail to develop the mutual acceptance of heart. But now, since we separately arrange what is desirable and what is reasonable into 2 rounds of voting, the situation has changed. Now the communicative rationality could work very well in the deliberative discussion in the second round in the scientific committees. It works very well in the small group or community, but it doesn't work in the big size, big scale society. So that Well, thank you.
It's a wonderfully rich view of democracy with fascinating institutional details. You know, at one level, what you're offering is a critique and a corrective to the characteristic flaws of democracy that philosophers have been identifying back to Plato, at least, the potential irrationality of democratic decisions based on majority will, when that majority will is not based on rational opinion. So the suspicion of democracy as dangerous because of its potential for irrationality goes a long way back in the history of political thought. And you're bringing it forward, however, into the 21st century by noting that there are particular distortions of public rationality that are characteristic of our time. So you talk about the systematic, well, you use the word, like Habermas, the colonization of opinion by the forces of capitalism, and what Habermas refers to as the systematic distortions of communication that emerge in an era of capitalism. So you're offering a corrective to the irrationalities of democracy that are distinctive, the potential irrationalities of democracy that are distinctive to our time.
I totally agree that we should worry about the public misuse of reason, as you said, Ting Yang, or what we could call pathologies of democracy. But look, often what is called a failure of democracy is not a problem of democracy. It's a problem of capitalism undermining democracy. It's a problem of racism and xenophobia undermining democratic deliberation. It's a problem of sexism leading to distortions of participation and will formation. So are these problems of democracy, inherent in democracy? No, they're problems of the social conditions that democracy is being placed in, and their pathologies transmit into dysfunctionalities of democracy. So to throw away, which you don't do, but some people say, oh, democracy is a flawed system. It's not true. In a flawed society, democracy will eventually be flawed. And so we hope that democracy will be the means that maybe, and that goes back to something I said earlier, democracy in a broader sense of a social activity rather than an institutionally frozen form, that democracy will be helpful in overcoming the pathologies that otherwise in society get reproduced through democracy. That was just a preface about talk that you don't use, but often people say, oh, but democracy is a pathological, completely ideological form of government. Look at what it does. I mean, Donald Trump, to mention a name that hasn't been mentioned in this discussion so far, has not been produced by American democracy. A figure like Donald Trump has been produced by the social forces and the economic forces and ideological forces in American society. Now, second point about the pro and con voting. I find this intriguing, Ting Yang. I think generally proposals about rethinking the institutions of democracy, I think, are very valuable. The two-vote system, where you say what you would prefer and also where you say what you would absolutely not want to have, will lead not just to options winning that get less cons rather than the most pros, which is a bit of a problem because if that happens, people might first of all get annoyed that the majority preference will not win the day. And as you know, because you studied rational choice and game theory, as soon as you establish this system, they will learn to vote strategically and be careful with their con vote. Another consequence is that in that system, where the options that have less cons have a better perspective of being successful, the more middle of the road, less radical options will fare better. This might be what you intend, but look, since in the first part of our conversation, we talked so much about change necessary in certain societies, especially those who benefit from unjust economic relations, sometimes we do need radical change. So if we had a voting system which gives priority basically to the do not change too much option, if that happened, because it has, you know, it has less cons, so it might be more closer to the status quo, that's just, you know, game theorists would know better, then it tends to be a more conservative system. Third remark about the 2 rounds of voting. We all see, not just in this pandemic, the importance of listening to science and its findings when you want to know which political arrangement needs to be chosen in order to overcome a crisis, avoid crisis, could also be financial crisis, and of course climate change. We all know notoriously how many people just reject findings of science and say global warming doesn't exist. And you know, I will not mention Trump again, but he's just he will go into the history books as the picture book of the many of the pathologies we have in mind here, right? Up until outrageously openly denying that he lost an election. So these are quite astounding experiments in creating a new reality, a different reality from the one that many people experience and also science attests. So I agree with the general thought that to include more rational deliberations and findings of science in decision making. But look, if we are realistically skeptical about the dangers, the ideological dangers of majority voting systems in democracies, why should we also not be realistically skeptical about the dangers of having 2 scientific bodies having a major say in which democratic decisions are feasible, can be upheld, and which cannot? So you know, use the same skepticism that you're using against democratic majority voting, which I agree with, and apply it to such scientific king's bodies, which, as you say, do not decide about what's desirable, but only about what's feasible. But as we know, once people have power, and scientists are not only scientists, they're also political animals, they might use that power and say, oh, that radical reform of the medical system in the US is not feasible at all, right? So if we look realistically at the dangers and the pathologies of democratic decision-making, if we looked with the same skepticism at the dangers of having scientific bodies checking on whether democratic decisions are feasible, we might have to reconsider whether we actually want to allocate that kind of power, which I take it is in your scheme is not a power to make legislatives think again, but it is actually a power to overrule what a legislative body or a popular vote has come about. And that is a lot of responsibility. And we might want to be careful about establishing such kinds of bodies. But you know, that is not, yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. So we've acknowledged the need for expert knowledge, but also the dangers of giving it too much power relative to the popular will. I wish we had more time to explore the nuances of democracy. One of the things we haven't gotten to, which I think we would need to get to if we were to have a full discussion, is takes us back to the idea that when we have a world whose problems cross borders, how could we institutionalize a democracy that has the features that you're describing here across borders? Would that be feasible, or do we need to think about democracy in a different way, as Reiner has suggested, as focused not so much on decision-making institutions, but on practices of justification or discursive practices that begin to connect political agendas, political possibilities, new ways of imagining our relations of interdependence with one another across borders. Unfortunately, we don't have time to further explore those themes right now. So I'd like to take us to a final question, to step back a little bit, to think about what it is that we've been doing in this conversation, bringing together ideas about justice, ideas about democracy, whose roots lie in much older philosophical traditions, traditions that are themselves situated in a particular social, historical, cultural context. Our ideas are inheritances that we claim from the past, and that past always has a location. And yet at the same time, you're both offering us theories that aspire to being recognizable as valid without reference to a particular context or location. You both express aspirations to the universal validity of your theories. So you also both make transcendental moves in constructing your theories. That's part of what generates the claim to universal validity, is that you believe that it's possible to justify philosophically a move to a context transcendent criterion of judgment that can be recognized by people from many different locations, different philosophical traditions, and different contexts. So that raises then a further question. If our theories are socio-historically situated and give rise to claims of universal validity that may be challenged as actually less context transcending than they might wish to be, then what is the purpose of the kind of conversation that we're having today? How do you understand this activity, this practice of philosophical exchange across intellectual traditions? And are there problems with claims to the universal validity of theories that have historically specific situated origins? Reiner, would you like to get us started on this round?
This is a difficult one, so I had hoped either you or Ting-Yang would start off, but okay, I'll give it a try. Look, we all have learned, and those who look back at the history of the Enlightenment I hope they have learned how many false universalisms have been produced, especially in the European context, where it wasn't just Enlightenment, it was counter-Enlightenment too. So often the two get connected in affirming the superiority, not just of European culture and the European Geist, but also with strong racist, not just undertones, but overtones, if that's a word. We have learned that many claims to universalism have been false claims. They have been claims to domination. And I think Ting Yang in his work makes use of that critique, and so do I. But when we criticize false universalisms, what are we doing? What is the notion of false that we're using? Aren't we presupposing that these bodies of thought were not truly universal? And aren't we, in using that critique, holding on to something that some of us, not me and not you two, think they should reject, namely that there is something universal to be found about how we should arrange our lives together. We might disagree about what the good life for each of us is, but a disagreement about how we should relate to each other is of a different nature. And I think to give up on the idea that there are better or worse universal standards about how I ought to treat others is not the right conclusion to draw from the critique of false universalism. That doesn't mean that arriving at true universalism is easy. But what we've been doing today, namely in a dialogical form, and dialogue does not exclude critique, right? But the whole point of it is in finding out something about something that we all think reason can at least get closer to in overcoming some mistakes, some contradictions. So since you were mentioning transcendental moves, yes, I do believe in reason as a discursive faculty, as a faculty of producing, testing, and rejecting justifications. And if we take that practice seriously, I think we ought, as Kant did, remind ourselves of what we are when we do this. Frail, finite beings who often are led astray, who might be in the grips of traditions, ideologies, and so on, by which I do not mean to say traditions are always ideologies, though ideologies are often traditions. But when we consider what we are, namely practitioners of justification, I think that reflection includes that we think of ourselves as each one, whatever capacity for justification we have, whether we are a great scholar like you two, or someone who just started to think about things, that in the space of reasons, of testing and rejecting justifications, we're all equals. And I think this is not just the most rational way of thinking about us, it's also the most humane way to think of us as equals in the possibility of finding out something about the universal, and in the possibility of going completely wrong when we thought we had found it.
Thank you. Ting Yang, would you like to conclude by answering this?
Yeah, a few words. You know, I don't deny I'm a universalist, but we are not advertising our cultures here. We seek truths. So I think that your question bring to the transnational or the transcultural problem we are having now. I think you know about it. I have involved with the transcultural dialogue with the Europe for many years. So sorry, my idea about it is quite big, maybe too big. You know, I'm thinking about the possibility of a new cyclopedia. Of course, it is a metaphor. It is supposed to be a world of knowledge, all knowledge, open to all knowledge, with no cultural borders. Then all knowledge could be resolved equally it is a kind of epistemological justice, if I could call it. I suggest two concepts to describe this new encyclopedia. One is the Leibniz. I think Professor Renner liked it. It should be the best possible world of composable and the richest collection of knowledge. And the second, we should find the focal points in syntax. I explain. The focal points, I mean it in the Thomas Schelling's sense. You know, it means the best place to meet together. So we should try to discover or recreate, to create the focal points of all knowledge when, you know, I mean the syntactualizing, it's my word. Any knowledge, that means to replace and retest and reinterpret a knowledge in the wider context of all knowledge. Then we are likely to find or create new focal points. I think if we have enough focal points, we will have this transcultural knowledge, justice, you know, anything like that.
That's wonderful. I'm very, very sympathetic to this idea. My own way of thinking about the kind of practice that we're engaging in is that we are drawing on different ideational resources to address problems that we may understand differently, but which we can join together in recognizing as problems that deserve our concerted ethical and philosophical attention. And so, to my mind, what we're doing when we theorize across cultures, across contexts, is not to try to reach a normative agreement necessarily about the problem that we're focusing on, but rather to gain greater clarity about the boundaries of the problems and the resources that we can find in different intellectual traditions, in different philosophical views that emerged as responses to their own problem situations, but which may provide deep guidance for us in confronting the problems that we can jointly recognize as problems for us in this stage of our relationship, in this stage of our history. So I think that this has been a rich conversation, very much in that spirit, that you've both joined by what joins this conversation is a focal point on the distinctive problems of justice in the 21st century. And you have both drawn on both your rich philosophical traditions from your own context and your own innovative thought, building on that in response to the problems and in response to each other. And so I am very grateful to you both for a wonderful conversation that I hope will continue.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for guiding us through this difficult terrain which we wandered through. This, I almost said afternoon, but it's morning with you and it's evening where Ting Yang is. Thank you so much, and thank you also, Ting Yang. I very much enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you, Renner. I think, Melissa, you are the best leader of the conversation, and I have learned a lot from Professor Renner Forst. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.